Maybe today you are in silence with God, a silence that is not absence but exhaustion, because praying for you has been an effort, not because you have lost faith, but because you are tired of talking, tired of waiting, tired of not knowing if God is listening. And within this tiredness, your prayer has changed tone. It is no longer born of hope. It comes from pain. And no one told you that this also tires heaven, not because God rejects your pain, but because he knows when you stopped praying to align yourself and started praying just to vent. And there is a difference, a sacred difference that Jesus showed us, but that almost no one paid attention to. The truth is that many times you are not praying, you are pouring out, throwing at God the words that the world did not hear, the tears that your family ignored, the weight that you carried in silence for too long. And all of this is real, all of this hurts. But when the outburst becomes routine and the listening fades away, something is lost. The prayer becomes a monologue, the soul becomes an echo, and God is silent, not because he is gone, but because you are so focused on being heard that you forgot to listen. How many times have you prayed and ended up even more anxious? How many times have you spoken to God as if you were trying to convince and not trust? Today, I want to tell you something with all the compassion, but with all the firmness that love demands. There are ways of praying that sabotage faith, and it's not because they are weak. It's because they are ungovernable, because they are sincere but not surrendered. They are emotional but not spiritual. They are long, but they do not listen. Jesus warned about this. He called them empty repetitions, words spoken urgently but without direction, cries that say a lot but reveal little of the heart. And maybe, just maybe, that's why you feel like there is no answer, because there is no listening, because your prayer has become a venting. But God is not a therapist of the soul. He is Father. He is Lord. If this bothers you, breathe. It's not a judgment. It's an invitation. God doesn't blame you for being tired. He understands. He saw you holding on to what no one else saw. He heard every whisper between tears. But now he's calling you to something deeper, to a prayer that doesn't unload, but aligns. A prayer that isn't an emotional release. It's a spiritual build-up, because heaven doesn't move with shouting. Heaven moves with faith, and faith isn't noise. Faith is surrender. In this video, we'll walk together through 7 ways of praying that take you away from the presence, even if they seem spiritual. And the last reason will surprise you, not because it's new, but because it might be exactly what you're experiencing right now, and you never realized it. If you have the courage to look at your prayer as if you were looking in a mirror, God will show you where the cracks are. And more than that, he will teach you how to build again, word by word, faith by faith, until your prayer stops being a scream and becomes incense. Accepted, received, answered. Let's go together. 1. When your prayer is an emotional outburst disguised as faith. There are people who pray with beautiful words, but with their spirit completely out of alignment. Others don't even try to appear strong. They pour everything out. They talk to God as if emptying a dirty bucket on the living room floor, and they think that this is faith. They think that because they are being sincere, God is listening with pleasure. But there is a silent and dangerous difference between being sincere and being spiritually out of control. Jesus never condemned crying, pain, or emotional expression, but he warned about something more subtle: empty repetitions, desperate speeches that only reinforce one's own chaos, prayer that revolves around pain but never gets anywhere, talks, but doesn't listen, pleads, screams, repeats, but doesn't give in. This is not surrender, this is a lack of control. And God does not reject your pain, but he does not feed your confusion either. The Father listens when his child speaks with faith, even if it is with tears. But when prayer becomes an escape valve and not an altar of surrender, something is lost. Because the focus changes, you stop praying to listen, and you start praying only to relieve. And prayer was not created to relieve, it was created to align. Prayer is a course adjustment, not a blind outburst. It is not a cry for help, it is an encounter with purpose. And where there is no listening, there is no direction. Where there is only emotion, there is no revelation. And without revelation, you pray a lot, but you go in circles. If you want to know if your prayer has become this disguised outburst, there is a simple test. Read your last prayer as if it were a letter. Read it out loud, carefully, as if it were God reading it for the first time. What would he answer? Did you write it with faith or fear? Did you cry out for direction or demand answers? Did you worship or did you just lament? Because the difference is in the spirit that carries the words, and God discerns the spirit. He is not impressed by intensity. He seeks truth, surrender, alignment. Jesus taught us to pray with simple, direct words full of confidence. He said, "Do not be like the hypocrites, for they think that they will be heard for their many words." He did not condemn the quantity of words. He warned about the quality of the heart behind them, because there are people who talk a lot, but believe little, who pray loudly, but listen weakly, who cry loudly, but do not obey the whispering of the Spirit. And maybe that's the point. God is waiting for you to stop yelling so he can speak, because he still speaks. But he doesn't compete with your noise. He doesn't enter the midst of your emotional turmoil to fight for space. He waits for you to remember that prayer is not therapy, it's an altar. And the altar is not a place to vent, it's a place to surrender. When you understand this, you'll stop praying for relief and you'll start praying for alignment. And that's when presence returns, that peace returns, that God's voice becomes audible again, and heaven finally opens up. 2. The tone of your prayer reveals whether you trust or just complain. There are prayers that don't ask, they demand. And it's not the content, it's the tone, it's the weight behind each word. Because there's a sound in the soul that God hears before the mouth even speaks, and it's that sound that reveals whether you trust or are just murmuring. David lamented. Israel murmured. Both were in pain. Both prayed. But only one of them touched God's heart, because the difference wasn't the situation, it was the spirit. David lamented as one who believes, even in tears. Israel murmured as one who accuses, even though he is being supported daily. And heaven hears the difference. How many times have you been frustrated by God's silence and turned it into a sullen prayer? How many times have you prayed as if to say, if the Lord loved me, he would have done something by now? How many times has your prayer been filled with resentment and demands rather than surrender and trust? There is a chasm between the lament that surrenders and the complaint that accuses, because those who lament still believe. Those who murmur demand. Those who lament cry out. Those who murmur complain. And murmuring does not move heaven. It closes off your listening. It hardens your heart. It creates a wall between your faith and the answer. When asked certain questions, Jesus would remain silent, not because he had no answer, but because his tone revealed disbelief, not true seeking. He read hearts, and even today, he reads yours. He knows when you are crying out in faith or simply uttering phrases that hide the anger you did not want to admit. And this type of prayer does not go beyond the ceiling, because it is not a prayer, it is an accusation with holy words. It is murmuring disguised as a plea, and God does not answer those who demand. He guides those who trust, those who throw themselves in, those who break themselves in order to be molded. If your words have been harsh, if your tone is demanding, Perhaps it is time to turn to your heart and ask yourself, why am I speaking to God as if I were disappointed with Him? Why is my tone not one of faith, but of frustration? Because heaven does not open to those who shout, it opens to those who believe. And faith has tone, faith has humility. Faith knows how to complain, but without losing respect. Faith questions, but with reverence. Faith suffers, but without accusing. Faith prays as a child, not as an inspector of heaven. It is not wrong to feel. God does not reject crying, but He notices when prayer is filled with distrust. And if your prayer is more like a complaint than a surrender, perhaps it is time to change. Transform the complaint into intercession, the lament into trust, the demand into surrender, because prayer is not meant to change God. It is meant to change you. And when that happens, even God's silence will begin to sound like presence, because heaven does not respond with proofs. It responds with peace, and peace only comes to those who still believe, even without seeing, even without hearing, even without understanding. 3. The danger of praying demanding proof, rather than asking for direction. Many people don't want spiritual direction. They want emotional reassurance. They want a sign that will take away their fear, that will end their doubt, that will prove that everything is okay. But this desire, as understandable as it may seem, can hide a heart that doesn't want to trust, that wants to control. And control is not faith. Control is anxiety disguised as spiritual seeking. How many times have you asked for a sign, not to confirm what God has already said, but to replace the courage you didn't have to obey? How many times have you prayed, "If it is your will, show me now," when deep down you already knew what God was asking you to do? Jesus stood before Herod, a man who wanted to see a miracle, a sign, something impressive. But Jesus didn't say a word, total silence. And that wasn't contempt. It was discernment. Because Jesus knew those who ask for a sign as a spectacle are not seeking salvation. They are seeking control. And when prayer becomes that kind of demand, heaven goes silent. Not out of punishment, but out of wisdom. Because God doesn't feed faith that only works with tests. He strengthens faith that walks with direction. Even if the road seems dark, even if your feet tremble. There is a subtle deception in this type of prayer. It sounds spiritual, but deep down it is an attempt to escape the responsibility of obedience. Because asking for a sign always seems safer than making a decision. Direction requires faith. Proof requires emotional confirmation. And God is not hostage to your insecurity. He understands your fear, but He will not feed your paralysis. He will give you peace, not control. He will give you direction, not a spectacle. And if you are waiting for a sign, to do what He has already commanded. Perhaps silence is the sign. Test your own soul. Is your prayer seeking an answer or surrender? Do you want to hear something new or obey what has already been said? Because there is a sacred difference between those who pray to know God's will and those who pray to try to convince God to change His plan. One surrenders, the other negotiates. One surrenders, the other manipulates. And true faith does not negotiate with heaven. It builds an altar. It climbs, even without knowing what will happen up there, like Abraham climbed with Isaac, like Jesus prayed in Gethsemane, with pain, but with surrender, with anguish, but with obedience. Faith is not a courtroom. Faith is an altar. And at the altar you don't demand. You bow, you surrender. You accept that control was never yours, and that all you really need is presence. Because those who have presence don't need proof. They need direction, and direction God gives, always, but only to those who are willing to obey, even if it's in the dark, even if it hurts, even if everything inside you is asking for a sign, because faith that matures learns to walk with a quiet heart. And a quiet heart is the first step to silent obedience. The one that God always honors, the one that heaven always recognizes. 4. Immature prayer, when your words to God expose your emotional dependence. Not all prayers reveal faith. Some expose needs. Some are so full of untreated pain that they become emotional cries disguised as spirituality. And the truth is that many times the way you speak to God reveals more about your emotional dependence than about your spiritual maturity. Speaking to God as if He were responsible for the decisions you insist on maintaining is a sign that something inside you has not yet healed. You pray, but your prayer comes with silent accusations, with words that blame disguised as supplication, as if to say, "Lord, why am I still here?" But deep down, you already know the answer and do not want to accept it. Jesus wept over Jerusalem, not because the Father failed, but because the city heard and did not listen, knew and ignored. And that breaks God's heart. Because there is a pain that comes not from blatant sin, but from silent resistance. You pray, you read, you even cry, but you continue to decide based on what you feel, not what you believe. And in this dynamic, your prayer becomes childish, an attempt to manipulate the answer rather than to mature in the process. God does not reject your pain, but He does expect your surrender, and surrender only happens when you recognize, "I am praying more to relieve guilt than to hear direction." Unhealed emotions distort everything. They make you think that God is being harsh when in fact He is being a father. They make you imagine that He is taking too long when in fact it is you who is resisting. A wounded soul wants quick answers. A mature soul wants discernment. And God speaks to those who are willing to listen, even when the answer hurts. He does not speak to those who only want spiritual anesthesia. He speaks to those who accept being treated. And spiritual treatment begins with the silence of the soul, with the humility to say, "Today I did not come to ask, I came to listen." Imagine for a moment praying without asking for anything, just listening, just acknowledging that God knows best, that heaven doesn't need to be convinced, that peace comes when you disarm your heart. Because praying without asking is a sign of someone who has matured, of someone who has understood that prayer is not a tool to get what you want. It is a place of transformation, of refinement, of listening, of alignment. It is when you say less and feel more, when you speak less and perceive more. Because the Spirit does not shout, it whispers. And only those who silence their own noise can hear. Your prayer is a mirror of your spiritual maturity, and sometimes what God wants to show you is not what to do. It's who you are becoming, because words can deceive, but the tone, the spirit, the intention, God never ignores these. And if you have the courage to stop justifying, to stop dramatizing, to simply shut up and listen, something will change. Your prayer will grow. It will mature. It will become more than words. It will become presence. And those who carry presence don't need justifications. They just need to keep going. In faith, in silence, in peace. 5. Why doesn't God answer? Maybe because He has already said everything. There are prayers that are not ignored. They are repeated and repeated and repeated, not because God did not answer, but because the one praying refused to listen. There are requests that heaven has already answered with a no, with a wait, with a close that door. But the insistent soul does not accept. It keeps praying, it keeps asking, as if insistence were proof of faith, when in fact it is a sign of resistance. And God, in His patience, is silent, not out of indifference, but out of wisdom, because He does not reinforce a cycle that already needs to be ended. He respects your freedom, even when it takes you back to the desert. Jesus spoke in parables. But it wasn't to make things difficult, it was to protect, because those who listen without wanting to obey transform the truth into judgment. So he spoke in a veiled way to hearts that had already decided not to change. And this continues to happen. You ask for confirmation, but ignore conviction. You ask for light, but don't want to see what is already clear. You pray for open doors, but you keep trying to break down the ones that God has already locked. And every prayer, in this context, is not a spiritual search. It is emotional stubbornness. And faith does not flourish in stubborn soil. It grows where there is surrender. Maybe it's time to take a spiritual inventory. Stop and remember, what were the last answers you received and ignored? How many times have you felt peace when you walked away but returned out of need? How many times has the word confronted you and you preferred to rationalize? Because insistent prayer is not always faith. Sometimes it is escape. And God does not reward escape. He honors obedience. And obedience, however silent it may seem, carries an authority that moves heaven. Insistence, without listening, only wears out the soul. Faith is nourished by obedience, not by repetition. Mature prayer is not the kind that shouts. It is the kind that accepts, that welcomes direction even when it is not pleasing, that recognizes no as care, that understands silence as protection, and that transforms the pain of waiting into spiritual strength. Those who do not hear God's no are not ready for the yes either, because the yes demands responsibility, the yes demands maturity, the yes demands faith that sustains, and not faith that only desires. If heaven is silent, perhaps it is because the answer has already come and you refused. Perhaps the direction has already been given and you have deviated. Perhaps what you call delay is, in fact, repetition, and God will not tell you again what you already know. He waits, not to punish you, but to see if you trust enough to obey without having to hear it again, because whoever obeys in silence proves that they have understood God's voice, and this faith heaven always honors, even if it seems late, even if it seems dry, even if it seems dark, because where there is obedience, there is a way, and where there is a way, there is a promise, and where there is a promise, God has been waiting, since always, since the last answer, that you still did not want to accept. 6. Prayer that pleases. God begins where pride ends. There are people who pray a lot, but they are still trying to convince God. And God is not convinced. He already knows, He has seen, He has understood. The prayer that touches heaven is not the longest. It is the most surrendered, the most honest, the one most devoid of justifications. Because there is a hidden spiritual root in many prayers, fear disguised as an explanation. You try to explain why you did it, why you couldn't, why you still feel it, as if God were a judge to be persuaded, as if His acceptance depended on your defense. But God is not waiting for you to justify yourself. He is waiting for you to surrender. Jesus told a story, a Pharisee and a tax collector. The first one prayed standing up with impeccable words. He defended himself, he exalted himself, he pointed out his good deeds. The other one just beat his chest. Have mercy on me. No explanation, no spiritual curriculum, no elaborate request, just surrender, just truth, just humility. And it was this one, the one who explained nothing, who came out justified. Because God does not listen to arguments, He listens to broken hearts. And broken hearts do not explain. They bend, they surrender. Maybe you're trying to use prayer as a court of law, trying to prove that you still deserve it, that you still believe, that you still try. But heaven doesn't move on merit, it moves on surrender. When you pray to justify yourself, you're revealing that you still fear rejection, that you still Don't understand that grace doesn't need explanations. It just needs space. And space only exists where there is surrender. When you stop trying to be strong, when you stop trying to appear spiritual, when you simply acknowledge, Lord, I need your touch, not your approval. Try writing a prayer without explaining yourself, without arguing back, without listing everything you did, just surrendering yourself, like someone who leaves their weapons on the ground, like someone who says, I have no more arguments, I'm just thirsty, because this prayer rises like incense, and incense doesn't need words. It rises through its smell, through its essence, through what it carries, and the incense that heaven receives is that of humility, that of the soul that kneels in spirit, that doesn't ask, doesn't convince, doesn't debate. It just adores, it just bows, it just loves. Praying while trying to convince God is a sign of pride, and where there is pride, prayer becomes speech. But when pride ends, the altar begins, and on the altar there is no defense, there is fire, fire that consumes what is false and reveals what is pure. The prayer that pleases God begins there, where you give up trying to explain yourself and finally allow yourself to be molded, transformed, restored, not as someone who needs to prove something, but as someone who has understood that being a son is more important than appearing righteous, because the Father is not waiting for your explanations. He is waiting for you. It's that simple, that whole, silent, and that's it. 7. God is not your employee, and your prayer is not a command. There is a way of praying that seems fervent, but is full of arrogance. It involves intense words, loud cries, memorized phrases, but the spirit behind it is not one of supplication. It is one of command. It is as if God were obligated to do something, as if the Lord had to act because you prayed hard enough, cried enough, declared with conviction. And this, in the eyes of heaven, is not faith. It is spiritual manipulation, a type of religiosity that hides behind the appearance of zeal, but which deep down is trying to force God's hand, as if he owed you something, as if heaven were an extension of his will and not the other way around. Jesus in Gethsemane sweated blood, extreme anguish, deep pain, but even at that moment his prayer was not a demand. It was an example of surrender. If it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. This is the prayer that God hears, the prayer that recognizes that even in suffering, even without understanding, even in tears, the Father's will is better. Because praying with faith is not giving spiritual orders. It is trusting even when all seems lost. And this trust is what moves heaven, not the loud tone, not the repetition, not the appearance of authority, but true surrender. There are signs that reveal when prayer has lost its servant spirit and taken on the tone of a master. When you pray more to determine than to discern. When you speak more than you listen. When you pray expecting God to confirm what you have already decided, instead of submitting to what he has already decreed. This is dangerous, because prayer that is born of spiritual pride may seem powerful, but it is stereo. It is noisy, but it does not generate transformation. It is declarative, but it is empty of surrender. And God is not impressed by shouting. He responds to obedience, to surrender, to trust that does not demand, but bows. True prayer has layers. It begins with gratitude, because before asking, the heart recognizes who God is. Then comes surrender, because before wanting, the spirit surrenders, and only then comes listening. Because those who pray with faith do not just speak, they listen, they wait, they are silent, because they know that God's voice is more important than their immediate need. And when you pray like this, even what doesn't happen becomes peace. Because you are no longer trying to force heaven, you are walking with it, and this harmony is the essence of true prayer. He who prays as a servant receives as a son, but he who prays as a master becomes frustrated. Because God does not follow orders, he keeps promises. He does not obey commands. He guides those who trust. And trust is silent. It is firm. It is gentle. It is full of faith. The prayer that pleases the Father's heart does not need to prove anything. It only needs to come from a heart that understands. Heaven does not move by the strength of your voice, but by the surrender of your spirit. And when the Spirit surrenders, heaven responds, always, even if in silence, even if with a no, even if with waiting. Because he who trusts already knows, if it is God who leads, it is better than anything I have asked for. Conclusion. Now that you have heard each part, take a deep breath, reflect. Because maybe God is not silent. Maybe it is you who are praying too loudly, too confused, too insistent to listen. Maybe your words are so full of fear, control, repetition, that heaven finds no room to respond. And if that is the case, it is not condemnation. It is correction. It is care. It is the touch of a father who does not want to see you tiring your soul, while trying to use prayer as a tool of insistence and not as a path of listening. The last reason surprised you, didn't it? Because it revealed that even the most fervent prayer, when born of pride or an attempt to control, can push people away more than it brings them closer. But it also showed you something profound. God is not ignoring you. He is calling you to a higher place, a place of surrender, of maturity, of silent faith, of prayer that doesn't need to prove anything, because the faith that is silent in order to listen is the one that receives the most, the one that touches heaven the most, the one that finds the most answers, even in silence. Perhaps until now, you have prayed as if you were trying to defend yourself, as if you were trying to persuade God, as if you still haven't understood that heaven already knows. It has already seen. It has already answered. Now it's time to change your tone, to get down from speeches and go up to the altar. Because it is on the altar that the fire descends, and the fire doesn't descend on shouting. It descends on sacrifice, on surrender, on faith. Stop speaking to God as if you were demanding, as if you were accusing, as if you were commanding. Start speaking to God as if you were trusting, as if you were surrendering, as if you were loving. Because prayer is not a negotiation, it is a consecration. And God does not want to see you defeated by prayer. He wants to see you transformed by it. And this transformation begins when you change your tone. When you understand that prayer is not about convincing God to act, it is about allowing him to change you. And when you change, everything changes. Presence returns. Peace descends. The answer comes, not always the way you want it, but always the way you need it. Because God does not fail. He only waits for the moment when your prayer stops being a scream and becomes incense. And when that happens, even heaven goes silent, to receive, to respond, to dwell, because after all, God always listens. But he really speaks to those who have the courage to listen. Thank you for watching the video. Please subscribe to the channel and leave your like to help this message reach thousands of souls around the world. Until next time.